Okay, well, thank you very much for the introduction and for the invitation to speak here today. It's such an amazing venue, so really impressive. Today I'm going to speak about the packaging and packaging waste regulation. So there are no videos in this presentation. It's really a legal presentation, but I hope it will be helpful to you all. And of course, I'm happy to take any questions on the subject. So very briefly, Keller and Heckman is an international law firm. Our main office is in Washington, D.C., but I'm based in Brussels. One of the unique features of our firm is that we have, while it's a law firm, of course, we still have 20 scientists amongst our staff, so both chemists and toxicologists. And that's mainly because we do a lot of work in relation to the food contact legislation, petitioning, substances to the European Food Safety Authority or to the FDA or other jurisdictions. And of course, they also support us in other areas such as the chemicals legislation. So just very briefly, I work mainly in the area of food packaging, but my role has very much expanded over the last 5 to 10 years, where we're getting so many questions on sustainability that expand far beyond the food contact legislation. So I work a lot in the areas of packaging waste, single-use packaging, green claims, etc. But we also have practices in other areas such as food, pharmaceuticals, medical devices, dietary supplements, cosmetics, a huge tobacco practice, and also in veterinary products, just to name a few different areas we work in. Okay, well, turning to the subject matter today, as I said, I'm going to speak about the PPWR. It's a very significant piece of legislation that came into force in February of this year, and that will apply from August 2026. Again, it's a very long piece of legislation, so this presentation is not intended to provide a comprehensive overview of the PPWR, but really to focus on some points that I think may be of particular interest to you. So what is the PPWR? First of all, it's a regulation. It repeals and replaces the Packaging and Packaging Waste Directive, which dated back to 1994, and that didn't work very well because actually packaging waste has been increasing in the EU with changes in consumer habits, increased use of single-use plastics, and so many other factors. Also, it's a regulation, so it's directly effective in the EU member states, so it doesn't have to be enacted in an international law like a directive. The issue with the PPWD, the directive, was that member states sometimes, interpreted its provisions in a slightly different manner. Of course, the main objective, ultimately, of the PPWR is to restrict excessive packaging and to really promote reuse and refillable solutions for packaging. I'm going to speak a bit about design for recycling and recyclable at scale requirements that are scheduled to come to apply actually by 2030 and 2035 respectively. I'm also going to talk about the mandatory recycled content requirements for recycled plastics. And also, I'll briefly touch on substances of concern, because that, of course, applies across all types of packaging. So again, it's important to keep in mind exactly, what the PPWR applies to, and really who needs to do what to determine what your specific obligations are under the PPWR. So again, in principle, the PPWR applies to all packaging, whether it's B2B or B2C. But again, if you look closely, you will see that some provisions apply only to particular types of packaging known as contact-sensitive packaging. And the PPWR actually defines the term contact sensitive. This includes food packaging, but also many other types of packaging that I've listed here. So we have, additives for animal nutrition, packaging for feed, packaging for cosmetic products, packaging for medical devices, in vitro diagnostic medical devices, medicated feed, veterinary medicinal products, packaging for food supplements, packaging for the inland transport of dangerous goods, and even the packaging for the eco-label for absorbent hygiene products. And so basically, it's really a very broad term, this whole concept of contact-sensitive packaging. So an important point is actually who is responsible for compliance with the PPWR. Again, it really prescribes obligations for different operators in the supply chain. They could be the manufacturers, they could be the authorized representative if the manufacturer is based outside the EU. We also, of course, have the suppliers of packaging and packaging materials, distributors, and even fulfillment service providers that are providing warehousing facilities. So also it's important to look at the definitions because it's the manufacturer that has the sole responsibility for conformity assessment. And the definition of manufacturer may not be what you'd normally conceive of as the manufacturer, because actually it's the natural or legal person that has packaging or a packaging product designed or manufactured under its own name or trademark. So if your trademark is on the packaging, you're likely to be considered to be the manufacturer of that packaging, even if you don't actually manufacture the packaging. So one exception is if the manufacturer is a micro-enterprise and the supplier of the packaging is based in the same EU member state. In that situation, the supplier would take over the role of the manufacturer. So again, the definitions in the PPWR are very important. So an important provision is substances of concern because the PPWR aims to minimize the presence and the concentration of substances of concern in all packaging. And really the PPWR has taken, it's an important initiative with respect to PFAS because we've heard a lot of talk about a PFAS ban being considered at the EU level under the REACH legislation. But the PPWR already incorporates a ban on PFAS that will apply from August 2026. And again, it sets out limit values for PFAS. So 25 ppb for any PFAS measured as targeted PFAS analysis, 250 ppb for the sum of PFAS measured as a targeted PFAS analysis, and 50 ppm for PFAS, all PFAS, including polymeric PFAS. So again, this will apply next year, and the Commission will conduct an evaluation to see whether this needs to be, amended or repealed in any way by 2030. There was also in the initial drafts a ban on bisphenol A in the PPWR, but actually this is separately dealt with now under the food contact legislation, so this was actually removed from the PPWR. So again, in the PPWR, there are heavy metal restrictions in packaging for lead, cadmium, mercury, and hexavalent chromium. They must not exceed 100 milligrams per kilogram. This provision is not actually new because it already existed in the Packaging and Packaging Waste Directive. So again, the Commission must take action under the PPWR. So the Commission, assisted by the European Chemicals Agency, must draw up a report by really the end of 2026 on substances of concern in packaging and packaging components, addressing the extent to which they may affect the reuse or recycling of packaging or its chemical safety. And again, they must indicate substances of concern which could present a risk to, unacceptable risk to human health. So it's interesting that the PPWR isn't actually limited to sustainability aspects. It actually also deals with safety. And I work a lot in the area of food packaging, and the food contact legislation already is intended to address the safety of food packaging. So this seems like, a duplication in some respects of the food contact legislation. So turning to recyclability, I will mention a lot of dates in this presentation. Sorry, I don't want to bore you, but there are legal requirements that must be complied with by particular dates. And I also should mention, I guess, it's important to keep in mind too that the PPWR is a framework legislation. So it's really setting out the high-level legislative framework that applies to packaging and packaging waste. But a lot of the details will actually be set out in implementing acts or delegated acts. So all of the details are not in the PPWR and will need to be drawn up in the future, basically, by the European Commission. And you'll see this as I work through this presentation. So the first important date is the 1st of January 2028. When the Commission must adopt delegated acts setting design for recycling criteria for packaging and recycling performance grades. So 2 years later, normally the 1st of January 2030, or maybe later if the Commission is delayed, all packaging that's placed on the EU market must comply with the design for recycling criteria. And if the packaging has a recyclability grade below 70%, it will not be considered recyclable. So it must be grade A, B, or C. And by 2038, it must be grade A or B, so 80% recyclable. Going a step further, in 2030, the Commission must draw up implementing acts establishing the methodology for recycling at scale per packaging category. So if you look at the Annex 2 to the PPWR, you will see, for example, for plastics, that it's divided out into all types of PET, different types of PET, PE, etc., etc. So you have to look at it per all the different grades of plastic material. And so all packaging must be recycled at scale by 2035. That's when the annual quantity of the packaging waste collected separately, sorted and recycled under each packaging category is greater than or equal to 30% for wood or 55% for all other materials. So this is an important step because it's all very well to say, look, my packaging is designed for recycling, but if there are no recycling facilities in place to recycle it, well, that's not going to be very helpful. And it would seem that really the member states have to play a crucial role in ensuring that the recycling facilities are in place by 2035 to ensure that packaging can actually be recycled at scale. And this is important also because the extended producer responsibility fees will be modulated based on the performance grade of your packaging. So the higher the grade you have, the less fees you will pay in EPR. So again, this is an incentive for companies to really ensure that the packaging is really a high level of recyclability. So again, this was a general picture. I would be remiss if I didn't mention that there are many exemptions. Despite the wording that all packaging must be recyclable by 2030, there are actually a number of exemptions. So again, the details matter here with respect to the PPWR. It's important to look at the exemptions to see if any of these could apply to your packaging. So for example, contact-sensitive packaging, basically food packaging for infant formula, follow-on formula, etc., are exempted. Also, immediate packaging for medicinal products and veterinary medicinal products, and the outer packaging, if this is necessary to really preserve the quality of the product. So again, it has to be looked at on a case-by-case basis. Others on the list are contact-sensitive packaging for medical devices, in vitro diagnostic medical devices, certain types of compostable packaging, because I'm going to talk about compostable packaging later, and certain types of packaging will be required to be compostable, and so they will be exempt from the recyclability requirement. Certain sales packaging is exempt, notably lightweight wood, cork, textile, rubber, ceramic, porcelain or wax, packaging for the transport of dangerous goods. And again, the Commission will review all this by 2035 to see if the exemptions need to be amended or updated in any way. It's important to note that there is an exemption for innovative packaging. So this is packaging that's really intended to, add something extra in terms of preserving the quality of the goods, and not simply intended to encourage consumers to buy more by, having beautiful packaging. So there is an exemption that could be applied for innovative packaging, and it would apply for 5 years. Next, I'll touch on recycled content requirements, because I think this is, something that came up quite a bit in the panel discussion, and I think it's an important theme of this conference, the whole recycled content. And indeed, it's certainly one of the challenges, I think, of the PPWR, notably in the food contact sector, where on the one hand, we have these recycled content requirements under the PPWR, but on the other hand, if you're trying to recycle a polymer other than PET under the food contact legislation, well, then the requirements are, extremely stringent and time-consuming to comply with. But in any event, by the end of 2026, the Commission must adopt implementing acts establishing a methodology for the calculation and verification of the recycled content recovered from post-consumer plastic waste. So again, we're talking about plastics here only, that are recycled and collected in the EU, and the format for the supporting technical documentation. Minimum recycled content requirements will apply for any plastic part of packaging. That will apply by 2030 or a bit later if the Commission is delayed. And again, terms such as plastic part haven't been defined, so it's really important to consider what your packaging is and how, where the interplay would be here with the wording of this legislation. But there is a list of recycled content requirements which vary depending on the type of packaging in question. So for contact-sensitive PET, so typically this is the polymer that's easiest to recycle for example, for food contact applications. They would need to be a 30% recycled content requirement by 2030, increasing to 50% by 2040. For other contact-sensitive packaging, again, it could be PP, PE, etc. The target for 2030 is 10%, because again, of the additional challenges of recycling this type of polymer to make it suitable for food contact and other contact-sensitive applications. Single-use plastic beverage bottles also have a 30% recycled content requirement by 2030, which will again increase considerably 10 years later. And all other plastic packaging will have a recycled content requirement of 35%. So here we're not necessarily talking about food packaging. It could really be, transport packaging or anything that's, less sensitive applications. So again, as you can see, a lot of information will be in acts to be drawn up at a later date by the Commission. They will draw up an implementing act in 2026, setting out sustainability criteria for plastic recycling technologies, and notably establishing the methodology for the calculation and the verification of the percentage of recycled content recovered from post-consumer waste that's collected and recycled in the EU. And importantly, they're also going to set equivalent rules for recycled plastic, for basically coming from post-consumer waste coming from outside the EU. So it's going to be interesting to see what those equivalent rules will be and how, how it will be determined whether recycled plastic, coming from outside the EU is of the same standard as that coming from the EU. So I won't go through all of the exemptions here, but just to note that there are many exemptions, again, from the recycled content requirement. Many of them are very similar to those for the recyclability requirement, as you will note. I guess one to call out is any plastic part representing less than 5% of the total weight of the whole packaging unit. So if you have a very small amount of plastic in your packaging unit, then you could potentially be exempt from this recycled content requirement. This might be the case, for example, if you have a coating on paper, where the coating would be less than 5%. And it also notes that if the food contact packaging would be exempted if the amount of recycled content would pose a threat to human health and basically non-compliance with the framework food contact legislation. So again, it's possible that if the recycling technologies for food contact applications, if really they aren't up to scratch by 2030, that there would be an exemption that would apply here. So bio-based feedstock was also mentioned, during the panel discussion as something that, companies are really looking at. And it's true that this is something that the Commission is also looking at. They're really looking into, or they're required to look into by 2028, the state of technological development and the environmental performance of bio-based plastic. And basically, based on their review, they could draw up a legislative proposal whereby bio-based plastic could be used instead of recycled content to fulfill the recycled content requirements. In cases, for food contact at least, where suitable technologies are not available at a sufficient level under the food contact legislation. So again, bio-based plastic could have an important role. Compostable packaging, again, this is an important aspect because if packaging is required to be compostable, it's not also required to be recyclable. So the PPWR mandates that sticky labels and, for example, permeable coffee capsules and etc. shall be compostable for industrial recycling facilities. By the 12th of April 2028, so that's quite soon. And again, member states may require that they also be compostable in home composting facilities. And member states further may require that non-permeable versions of, for example, coffee capsules, etc., could be required to be compostable. So again, member states have some discretion here to play. And notably, from 2028, other packaging, including biodegradable plastic polymers, they must be designed for recycling without affecting the recyclability of other waste streams. So again, it's important to, really focus on compostable packaging and what's happening there. Turning next to labeling, as you'll note, a lot of the details really need to be drawn up in implementing acts. So the Commission is going to draw up a harmonized label and specifications for labeling requirements and formats and a methodology for identifying the material composition. And that would happen by August 2026. 2 years later, by August 2028, all packaging placed on the market must include a label with information about the composition of the product and consumer sorting. So again, it must be based on pictograms and it must be easily understandable, and it's noteworthy that transport packaging is exempted. So at the top of the slide here, I have pictures of the different symbols being considered by the European Commission. And this is important because at the moment, as I'm sure many of you are aware, there are different color schemes in different EU member states for different types of packaging waste. So it's very confusing for consumers, but it's very difficult for industry as well if they want to sell their packaging in different EU member states and really use the same label. So this is something that should be overcome at least by the PPWR. So again, for compostable packaging, if it's compostable, you must indicate that the packaging must not be disposed of in nature. Again, the idea is to avoid littering. So if you're claiming it's bio-based content, again, details will be drawn up there, but labeling requirements will apply. There will be a labeling requirement for reusable packaging, to tell users how to really, reuse the packaging, the collection points, and this can all be provided by a QR code. And importantly, with respect to substances of concern, these will actually need to be, identified by name on the packaging, and the identity of the substance of concern would need to be provided for each material in the packaging unit. So obviously that is quite a big development, because this information will need to be basically put before consumers. And again, there will be equivalent labeling requirements for the waste receptacles. So again, as I said, I cannot get into every detail on the PPWR. I focused on a few aspects, but it's just to note that there are many other requirements for reuse and refill, some of them giving quite a high degree of discretion to EU member states, actually, to increase targets or to expand the scope. There's quite a bit of focus on deposit and return schemes, packaging minimization. There will be, this obligatory empty space ratio has to be reduced between the outer transport packaging and the sales packaging. Certain types of packaging are banned under the PPWR, such as, for example, packaging grouping goods, such as tubs, etc., in supermarkets, to really just with the sole objective of encouraging consumers to buy more. So again, there are additional, as I said, packaging bans. There are quite extensive requirements with respect to extended producer responsibility. There are some steps to harmonize extended producer responsibility, but nonetheless, the member states retain a great level of discretion in that area and will be operating, their own schemes in quite some ways. There are also, of course, requirements in the labeling section regarding green claims. I mean, in a snapshot, you cannot make a green claim for your product if you're basically just complying with the basic requirements of the PPWR. So, for example, there's a 30% recycled content requirement for PET by 2030. Your packaging only contains 30% PET. Well, you cannot make a green claim for that because you're simply meeting the minimum requirements of the legislation. So again, as I've said at the outset, a lot of the details will be drawn up by the Commission in implementing acts and legislation. The Commission is going to be very, very busy in the coming years. We have 11 implementing acts and 4 delegated acts to be drawn up, along with many reports, standardizations, and other things, and guidelines, of course, for industry. So it looks like all of this is going to be a challenge, and a lot of the details actually required to comply with the PPWR will be in these implementing acts and delegated acts, and even the guidelines, of course, will be needed to deal with certain aspects. So to conclude, the PPWR, I think, is a major development in how packaging and packaging waste is regulated in the EU. It's not dealing just alone with food contact packaging, but it's really dealing with all packaging placed on the market in the EU. So the Commission has said they seem to be confident that they will be drawing up all of these implementing acts and delegated acts on time. But again, I must stress that the devil will be in the details, so the important information will be in the details of these implementing and delegated acts. So as the Commission is commencing work on these, I think it's important for you all to really study the PPWR, how it impacts on your packaging. You know the industry, best. Very often legislators are not aware of how, certain provisions of the legislation might impact a very particular type of packaging. So it's important to be proactive and to make the Commission aware of any issues that you see with the PPWR so that they can take this into consideration when they're drawing up their implementing and delegated acts. The Commission is also supposed to publish a questions and answers document on the PPWR and has requested that industry submit any questions to them that they want to be addressed. So that's it from me, and I'm happy to take any questions.
Okay, thanks very much indeed, Hazel, for that very clear explanation of what's clearly an extremely complicated topic. So really appreciate you helping to understand what's going on there. We do have time for questions, if anybody's got anything that they would like to ask. Yes, in the front row. I think do we have a microphone? If not, if you can.
Thank you, Hazel. Do you have an idea of how PCR percent is it going to be calculated or measured? Because it is a very complex matter to do, I think.
I think it is a complex matter. I mean, this is something that will need to be, drawn up by the Commission. They have done some work on recycled content under the Single-Use Plastics Directive, and how that is actually calculated. And I know they've been looking in that context at chemical recycling and the mass balancer approach as a way to calculate the recycled content. So I understand, this is something that they will consider a similar approach under the PPWR. But again, they haven't actually at this time, published any details as yet as to what exactly they're going to do. So,
okay. Thank you.
Thanks for that. Any other questions? On the design for recycling criteria, and that sounds like a really difficult thing to judge because every product's very different. How are those criteria going to be set, and how are they going to be assessed? You had the different ABC. Is it as simple as if it's a monomaterial, it's an A, or how does it work?
Yeah, I mean, in the PPWR, they just outlined, different information. Obviously, they have the packaging divided into various different types. So for PET, you could have maybe 5 different types of types of packaging. And so the design for recyclability requirement will be per packaging type and format. So that's one thing that will be taken into consideration. But I think otherwise, it's just really, indeed, I think it'll be, the trade associations are already working, of course, on design for recycling criteria, and it would be indeed looking for things of like simplifying packaging, using a monolayer instead of a multi-layer where that's possible, possibly not using certain colorants where they are additives maybe to the packaging, where this might actually impede the recycling process of the packaging. I think these are the kind of criteria that they would consider more generally with respect to that. But obviously, again, the details need to be drawn up as yet. But certainly, I think in the meantime, many trade associations have drawn up design for recycling criteria that are very specific to particular materials. So it would be a good idea to take a look at those. With respect to if you have a particular interest in paper or in a particular type of plastic, for example.
And on that subject, obviously here we're focused on plastics products. Are you able to say how other industries, how other materials are reacting to PPWR? Is there reaction similar to what you're seeing in the plastics industry?
Yeah, I think a lot of companies are, still coming to terms with the PPWR and trying to understand how it will impact them. We've seen of course, on the other hand, some of the major brands, they're already, we've seen, a lot of work has been done already in coffee capsules to make sure that they're already compostable, for example. So, there's quite probably some differences depending on the size of companies and the in-house capabilities they have to deal with all of these new requirements, because it's kind of a snowball of new requirements. So it's not necessarily material type per se, although some materials may be easier to recycle than others. But it's certainly, I think, often down to the size of the company and the capacity they have to deal with these new requirements. The Commission has said, it has exempted micro enterprises from some of these requirements, but still, there are still smaller companies that have to grapple with all these changes.
Okay, any other final questions? Okay. If not, thanks again very much. Thanks very much, Hazel.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you.